When learning about early American colonial history and religion in the classroom, American textbooks include the commonly known story of Anne Hutchinson. What they leave out is the more interesting and tragic story of her dear friend Mary Dyer. She emigrated along with her husband to the colony of Massachusetts in 1635 from England. She became a close friend and follower to the popular midwife Anne Hutchinson. According to Johann Windsor in Mary Dyer and the Monster Story, on October 17, 1637, she went into labor suddenly while Mary was in the 7th month of her pregnancy. The stillborn infant girl was severely malformed. The birth was concealed because they lived in a society that was steeped in biblical metaphors. Hutchinson was one of 2 midwives present. According to Francis Bremer in his Dissenting Puritans Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer, after this event, Mary returned for a time to England. She became a Quaker. The Quakers taught that an inner light of God was within all men and women, and returned to New England determined to witness this truth. Women played a prominent role in Quakerism, and they traveled along with the men very widely during those early years. However, legislation had been passed in 1656 stipulating that Quakers be banished. Nevertheless, according to Anne Miles in From Monster to Martyr, representing Mary Dyer, in 1657 Mary Dyer arrived in Boston along with 2 fellow Quaker missionaries from England, William Robinson and Marmaduke Stevenson. They were all arrested and thrown into jail without bail. All later were released and banished, but the men decided to stay in Massachusetts to challenge the laws. She returned a second time to see her friends, and they were again arrested, tried, and this time sentenced to death. Her family pleaded, and the public didn't really approve of the execution of women, and so they decided to banish her again. In 1660, despite her family's insistence, she re-entered Massachusetts for a 3rd time. She was jailed, tried, and hanged, the only woman to be executed as a Quaker. And her story is different from that of Anne Hutchinson because, unlike Hutchinson, she never backed down like Hutchinson had done by the time of her 2nd trial. One of the reasons why Quakers were something of a threat to the Puritan order was because they were a challenge to the Puritan elite male church members. They were a threat to men like John Winthrop and the others. According to Johann Windsor in his Mary Dyer and the Monster Story, her adversaries were motivated to discredit her movement, and they made a public spectacle of Mary's tragic birth. This surely added to the grief that she and her family had endured and continued to publicly endure. John Winthrop, who was the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, used this story, had the child dug up, and used it against Mary Dyer. And by 1642, the tales of Mary Dyer's monster moved into print and brought her still more widespread notoriety in England. And one can only imagine how she must have felt as she became the woman known as the woman who had a monster. According to Anne Miles in From Monster to Martyr, representing Mary Dyer, Dyer's life can be summed up like this. She returns again and again to where she confronts institutional power. By insistently refusing to vanish or be silenced by the authorities, she symbolically does what Anne Hutchinson had done before. And Dyer's experience, along with her martyred friends, had profound political and religious impact, even reaching the restored Charles II, who would go on to forbid further executions. Today, both statues of Hutchinson and Dyer stand outside the State House in Boston, and yet very little scholarship really exists about the many Quaker writings and the texts, mostly neglected. And nevertheless, the story of Mary Dyer is that of a dissenting woman who refused to be silenced and shows martyrdom. Mary Dyer merits a place in American history. Her story should be side by side with that of Anne Hutchinson. Her story should not be overlooked.